Right. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Grand, CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live. It's great to see everybody. This is a weekly series that we do during the MedTech Innovator Accelerator to share expertise about bringing products to the market. For those of you who've never been here before, MedTech Innovator is an accelerator, but we're a little different than many in that we are what I would call a downstream accelerator. And what I mean by that is that we are focused on companies that aren't just a bunch of people with an idea and they're trying to change healthcare. These are companies that are up and running. They've already been funded in most cases, almost all cases. They've got teams, they've got products that are certainly at least at the prototype stage. They've got early evidence that those products work. Or they've got significant evidence. They're in the market in some cases. They're not just people are at the prototype stage. They're on the market and they're serving customers and everything in between. So we run this accelerator with the intent of helping these companies bring their products to the market with as much value as possible. And by that, what I mean is that we have a real problem in our innovation system, not just in the US, but everywhere, in that there's all this great technology that gets developed and that gets approved by various regulatory bodies and often sits on a shelf somewhere because there was some mistake made along the way. And I'm not talking about whether the technology works or not. I'm saying the technology works, but there was some other decision made that was probably a bad decision that wasn't informed properly. And as a result, people can't buy this product. And that is something we want to avoid. We don't like it when people go through this whole process and spend years of their life bringing something to the market and then no one uses it. That's not good for anybody. So part of what we do during the accelerators, we gather experts on different topics and we give them the opportunity to share their wisdom with our innovators, as well as with anyone who's out there on YouTube watching this as well, or LinkedIn, so that you have the ability to benefit from that same experience, even if you're not in our accelerator. So if you are out there watching this live, you're welcome to submit a question in the YouTube chat box, and we will take that input and we'll try and ask our panelists here live during this hour. If we don't have a chance to do that, we'll try and gather your question and put a comment later on in the comments box if we can in the archive so that you still get your question answered as best as we can. It will be an hour, and at the end of that, we'll spend another 30 minutes just with our innovators who are here on Zoom with us, and they'll have the opportunity to ask questions in a Q&A session at the end privately, so that will not be broadcast. So that's the ground rules again for our companies that are here. As always, please queue up your questions in the Q&A and I'll watch for those. I may weave them into the conversation in the first hour, but usually I leave those for the end. If you really need to ask a quick question, you can do that with the chat, but we try to save all this stuff for the end for the discussion. So that's it. With that, let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So one of the really interesting things to cover is supply chain for the hospitals and providers and customers out there, and what's involved in that, because a lot of the innovators that we've worked with over the years don't have good visibility into that. And they're not really thinking the way a customer is thinking when it comes to how this product is going to get distributed, how it's going to get used, and how a customer is thinking about your products. And so that's some of the education we're going to do today is covering some of those things today. And really important for today, I want to make sure that, again, everyone understands when I'm talking about supply chain and when the other panelists are talking about supply chain, we're not talking about manufacturing supply chain, meaning if you were developing a product, how are you sourcing your parts for that product per se and your components? That's a different discussion we can have another time. But today we're going to be talking about it from the customer perspective. So that's the overview. And let's go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. So we've got three great expert panelists. I'll bring them here one by one to tell us a little bit about themselves and their companies. So I'm going to begin first with Michael, who's with Steward Health. So Michael, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little about you and your company.
Hello, I'm Michael Prokopis, Senior Vice President of Supply Chain at Steward Healthcare. We are a 44 hospital system located in 10 states and 3 countries, so a relatively large geographic footprint. Our GPO is Health Trust, which makes for an interesting set of conditions that we try and do the best that we can. But at the end of the day, Steward's all about delivering value-based healthcare in our community hospitals, which tend to be on the lower income side of the equation. And so kind of fundamental to our beliefs is regardless of race, gender, class, everyone should have equal access to quality care. Every decision we make is run through a value analysis lens. His responsibilities, I'm responsible for value analysis, data analytics, contracting, sourcing, and then also have a pretty significant operations team, which is, if you will, the tentacles into the hospitals. So nice to be here today.
Fantastic. Great having you here today. Thank you for joining us. Let's move on then to Dan Baker, Cardinal Health. Dan.
Hey, Paul. Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation to be here with you all. Dan Baker, 20 years in digital health, joining Cardinal Health to lead the WaveMark business unit sales and commercialization function for the last year. Prior to that, spent about 10 years in the electronic health record space, several years in the revenue cycle management space, and then 4 years building a 2-sided network in precision medicine and oncology. Had my own consultancy before joining Cardinal Health WaveMark, identifying a massive opportunity for a technological revolution. So WaveMark, what we do, we're a wholly owned business unit of Cardinal Health. We create the operating system for the clinically integrated supply chain. You know, one of the last great frontiers for an actual enterprise piece of software. It started in finance, moved to clinical in the EHR. Supply chain is having its moment now in an elevated purpose and importance with a lot of the topics we'll talk about today. And an increased need has become abundantly clear for a singular operating system. So we create that system. And by virtue of it, we work with about 15% of US acute today, 25% of the top Gartner 25 health systems. So we have a very good macro view on how large health systems are using data to make better decisions for their supply chain and fuel the new joint ventures between clinical and supply.
Excellent. That's fantastic in terms of a background, and I know we're going to have a lot to delve into on that. So now let me introduce Alicia Behringer. So from Northwestern Medicine, Alicia. Oops, I think I muted you by accident.
Yes.
There you go.
You got me.
Gotcha.
So yes, my name is Alicia Behringer. I am the Director over Supply Chain Logistics here at Northwestern Medicine. Northwestern Medicine is located in the Chicagoland area. We have about 11 hospitals and a bunch of clinics, about 2,900 beds. We serve over 1 million patients. We have about over 4,000 physicians. I've been with Northwestern for a little over 5 years now. I oversee all of our supply chain technology from a strategic and an implementation perspective. I also oversee a team that is focused on operations for the system for inventory, which is something we did not have before, as well as a strategy and a team to oversee lab supply chain, which is a new venture for us. Before I was at Northwestern, I worked at Owens & Minor, which is a healthcare distribution organization, for close to 10 years. So between the almost 15 years experience, I've been both on the distribution and supplier side, and also now on the provider side. So I've seen both sides of the coin. But thanks for having me, and happy to be here.
Great. Well, happy to have you here too, all 3 of you. So great. I want to start off and just, I teased this a little bit in my introduction, but ultimately the people who we're talking to today, who are listening, most of them are innovators themselves. And by innovators, I mean startups. They're smaller companies. Some of them are scale ups. Maybe they do have 100 employees. But they're certainly not. They're not Cardinal Health. They're not some of the the larger companies. And so I just want to start off and just ask, kind of individually. I'd love to hear how are you engaging with these smaller companies and startups And just kind of just putting it out there, just so we have that for everyone to think about is, do you engage with startups and smaller companies, and how do you engage with them? Are there some specific programs? Do you have an innovation program where you're specifically looking for startups? I'd love to start there. So I'm going to start with Alicia first on this.
Yeah, so here at Northwestern, we do a little bit of both. We have partnerships with larger organizations, and then we also have an innovation center that focuses on putting that time, money, and resource into startups. For me personally, in supply chain, being on the technology side, see it both ways. We work with the large organizations, but there is something about startup companies where they are more willing to build something for you. They will work with you and partner with you to hear voice of customer, build something based on voice of customer as the beginning, versus some larger organizations will have already a tool that they sell to you and then work on enhancements over time. So here at Northwestern, we've done both, and we always are looking for the next thing. And it really does benefit sometimes to start with the companies that are just the 4 people willing to do whatever it takes to create that tool or that widget or that technology that works for the customer, versus kind of a top-down approach to say, here's our solution. Hopefully it works for you. And if not, we'll work to enhance it over time. So there's benefits of both. A lot of times with the larger organizations, they have a lot of customers. They already have some of the knowledge and they're not building it from scratch. So you don't have to put a whole lot of IT time or just time building it and figuring it out. So there's benefits and drawbacks to both.
Excellent. Yeah, I can completely understand. And as you said, these startups are spending a lot of time, hopefully, with that voice of customer and making sure they're trying to build something that people want to use and get that product market fit. So there's definitely good benefits to that. I'd love to hear some other thoughts on this from Michael and Dan. Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. A couple thoughts. Well, I don't know if I've you froze or I see Alicia still on the
screen. Yeah, you're still here.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, we have so a couple of different thoughts. We kind of think about innovation in a couple of tranches. There's kind of the what I'd call the infrastructure, IT facilities, and then there's kind of the clinical side of the house. And I think those two things really have different audiences and different requirements for the way we think about it. As community-based care, we're not necessarily going to do the exact same types of things that you might see at some of the leading teaching institutions around the country. However, with that said, we have world-class physicians who very much are interested in what's next that's going to deliver a better quality outcome for the patients that they're trying to serve. From an infrastructure perspective, we can take flyers and a lot of what Alicia said around thinking through voice of the customer and what our requirements are and evolution, intellectual property, and how we do that. We spend time doing that. And inventory management is an area we'll probably talk a little bit more on later, but I think there are some exciting startup opportunities in that category for healthcare that haven't been addressed yet. On the clinical side, though, you've got to always make the balance between what is your mainline vendors and distributors bringing to the table versus where you're going to kind of pocket in clinical innovation. And from that perspective, I think that we have to kind of pick and choose. And oftentimes it's led by the clinicians to say, we want to evaluate X or Y. And then it's up to the corporate team to figure out where's the differentiation and how are we going to use it in a way that's meaningful. Because remember, at the end of the day, with 44 facilities, we're always looking for standardization at the same time as optimization. But that doesn't mean we should ever turn our backs on innovation.
Agreed. And I'll definitely want to dig into that inventory management technology later. We'll talk about that as well. So that's great. And also, Michael, again, your perspective, having the community hospital lens, I think is really important because there's also, there's often misconceptions. Well, there's realities and there's misconceptions out there about community hospitals. the perception, I would say, is that, it's the big academic centers, those are the ones who just bring in innovation, and the community hospitals, they're not going to touch this stuff until later. So it's good to hear that there is interest, and we can dig into that in a little bit. So thanks. And Dan, what do you want to share?
Yeah, so I'm coming at a unique purview. Obviously, 50,000 employee Cardinal Health. We've got a large innovation arm. We make big investments into cutting edge technologies. We have a wholly owned incubator in our Fuse business unit. But the purview that we're able to see from just the macro level data that we have is really interesting in how it's changing behaviors. So I think Michael hit on it perfectly. It's usually clinician led, right? And that's the way you get a new device to market. You show a clinician the valid evidence, and you get in there and you start selling. Your reps are selling. What's changing now is the paradigm shift of transparency, where it is no longer sort of the specials. And I was meeting with the SVP of clinical effectiveness at a large Midwestern health system recently. With part of their initiative of deploying the enterprise-wide solution is to get after the specials. So this is a flag, I think, for everyone on the call, that it's not going to be as easy for institutions that have implemented sort of the enterprise-wide system. I don't want to say to sneak in your devices, but to be able to do individual contracts with independent departments anymore. This is getting consolidated, and the transparency is leading to this consolidation and a cost reduction effort. So that's changing. So the punchline is that supply chain has to be your partner in all of this, right? Not only do we need to show clinical efficacy to the champion physicians within an institution, but we also have to make sure that we are communicating that same value to the value analysis committee, and then you are partnering with supply chain for standardization of contracting.
Excellent. That really helps to frame some of this, and I really want to unpack later, Dan, some more things related to what you're doing in terms of that, providing that operating system, if you will, kind of across the institution. So we'll dig into that. So let's just again, just one other thing too. I think it's already been hinted at a bit in that there's some new things like Alicia before mentioned. Having lab supply chain and some things maybe perhaps that weren't as the pandemic, let's just say, has unlocked some needs at institutions to think more about some areas that maybe they weren't thinking as much about before. And a lot of what I've seen over the last several years has been a lot of innovation that's been absorbed to react to the pandemic and the remote environment, and some existing initiatives that were already in place towards moving towards hospital at home, things like that, and maybe things have been accelerated in that way. I want to get into before we get into some of the weeds here, I want to think a little bit about what do you see maybe on the near term horizon and going into the future, where from what we've learned now during the pandemic and where we're going. What do you think the medical supply chain is going to look like? We're getting much more robust. And any examples you can provide about what a best-in-class supply chain would look like would be terrific. And Dan, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're fortunate enough to partner with the #1 supply chain in the U.S., so we learn a ton from them, as ranked by Gartner. So we have sort of seen the future a little bit, and we're starting to act on it. We're doing really interesting things around real-time transparency between the origination of demand signal, meaning it all has to emanate from the patient. The moment we know a patient's going to be scheduled for a procedure, we know that physician's preference card and can match that against current on-shelf inventory and say what's going to be needed. So it emanates from the patient. Signals come from the preference card, which gives downstream distribution optimal time, ultimately giving manufacturers the data they need to have the highest level fill rates and response rates. So that is what's been missing from healthcare for a long period of time, is the true end-to-end communication points. That's what technology's opportunity is in the supply chain now, to be able to bridge that gap. So with some of the largest manufacturers, we're underway with active pilots to be able to exchange that information bidirectionally. So not only can manufacturers have visibility into their full consignment inventory, what's where, which they haven't had as accurate information historically. But health systems also have visibility into backorder, stock out risks, and can plan appropriately using real data from the patient scheduling system within the electronic health record. So it's that end-to-end communication, which has never existed. It's been siloed and pieced together, oftentimes in Excel spreadsheets to the best of individuals' abilities, but that's what's changing.
And others, Alicia, Michael, your thoughts on both what Michael just said, as well as any other thoughts about, what's the best in practice supply chain look like?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Dan on the end-to-end. I think too is what we're looking at is, providing that visibility to make better business decisions, but because due to the pandemic, resiliency has been a key term in the last couple of years when it comes to supply chain. Any conference, any call, any meeting, it's all about resiliency and digitization. And it's looking more of how you can build teams to look at risk predicting versus being reactive. I think current state, we wait till people come to us or things go on back order and we are more reactive. Future state of supply chain would be putting those time and resources into figuring out how to quantify risk, how to predict risk, and what are the alternatives if a risk happens. Already having those plans in place to have a backup plan and then a backup to the backup. But also, in sourcing, past however many years, we've really focused on standardization, leaning out the amount of vendors that we have on the shelf. I think future state is trying to find that balance between being resilient and not creating waste and still staying lean. How can we have more vendors to partner with so we're not, if our one vendor goes on back order, we're kind of in a position where we're at risk for patients first and patient safety, but also putting ourselves in a position where we don't become unstandardized. We don't have a ton of waste coming out of our hospitals and our shelves because we have way too many options. So it's finding that balance between being resilient, but also not being so lean that we put ourselves in a risk situation. And I think one more is just holding our partners more accountable. I know at Northwestern, we have a great partnership with our distribution vendors and some of our big technology vendors, but a lot of our individual manufacturers, we're not holding them to the same standards. So creating more of those vendor scorecards, quarterly business reviews, asking them how they're going to make sure that we have the right product at the right time and at the right quantity, and basically tell them how they're doing. It always comes out in the time of distress, how well a vendor is going to come and help you out. And I think they need to know that, like, hey, as a customer, there are things you need to work on because in time of distress, you were not there for us. You caused more problems than helped us. And I think getting back into those vendor scorecards where it's not with distribution partners, but all of your big vendors will become a priority.
Fascinating. That's a really, really, really interesting thing to get into. And I'm going to want to dig more into that. Michael, any other comments from you?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I kind of think about it. You wrote down some bullets. Kind of four main topics. The first is around data and data intelligence. We talk about digitization, we talk about transformation. They're those extreme buzzwords that people use all the time. But what do they really mean? Because at the end of the day, if you don't start with an internal deep dive yourself, what are you really doing? So, at Steward, we decided several years ago we were going to align all product categories using unspec specifications. And so we've done that. We've gone through and created a pristine item dictionary, even though we're operating in 4 different ERPs. We have one master item dictionary that is, if you will, the standard for everybody. And that's the basis of which we start asking the question of clinical equivalency from. So data is extremely important. We have to invest the time and the energy. And it's not something that you do in 3 months. It's something that you tackle today, tomorrow, and then every day thereafter. Constantly trying to make sure that your data has integrity and consistency so that it becomes useful and actually tells you a story. Dan talked a little bit about demand planning, and I actually want to push the envelope even further. Our distributors and our vendors work off of our historical 12-month average. And to Dan's point, I know several weeks, maybe even a month in advance, some of the procedures I'm going to be executing, and I know the preference cards. And so to the point is, we know what those supplies are in the short term. At Steward, we have a mission control capability where we actually project bed vacancy 7 days in advance with 98% confidence. I've now started saying, let's quit looking through the rearview mirror and start looking through the windshield. How do we get a true 12-man demand plan, a 12-month demand plan put together, like other industries do? Auto manufacturers make projections 3, 4, 5 years into the future, and they don't have some of the same kind of demand forecasting issues that we do in healthcare. And people say, well, it changes and it's this and that, but we all go through formal budgeting cycles. We all make estimations of what our service lines are going to look like next year. And so it really becomes a question of the discipline to continue to challenge yourself throughout to make sure that your data is accurate. And then what are you sharing with your vendors? Are we sharing it with Cardinal? Are we sharing it with Medline and Medtronic? Are we sharing it with even with our GPO Health Trust? And then making sure that we're holding each other accountable as we're trying to talk about accuracy and forecasts. The third big part of it is interesting because we're challenging our distributor now. It's what I'm calling blurring the lines of inventory. I can look at a nurse's closet and call it an inventory location. I can look at the 4 walls of my hospital. I can look at a pod of hospitals in a region. I have 5 facilities in Salt Lake City. What if I included the distribution center for my distributor, including the 5 walls of those 5 hospitals? And so when you start adding that in that multiplicative perspective, there's a very simple equation in supply chain that says the amount of inventory that you need is N divided by the square root of the number of facilities or the number of locations. And so every time you add a location to the equation, you're expanding your inventory. So blur the lines and look at it as one inventory location, not hundreds of inventory locations, which is what we tend to do today. And then the final one around risk and resiliency, I do agree that we have to be very careful with the balance between standardization and optimization. In a perfect world, you'd have one vendor provide everything because that's where your best value is going to be. But we know that we can't necessarily hitch our horse to that wagon. We saw the results of that in multiple instances, and not just the pandemic. Go back 5 years ago with the hurricane in Puerto Rico, and we were all scrambling for IV solutions. So those are lessons learned that talk very much about resiliency and risk mitigation. And if you look to other industries, I'm going to use automobiles again, they believe in a strong number 1 and a strong number 2. Strong number 2 may only have 20% market share, but they're there, ready and able and capable of delivering a higher volume if something happens to your number 1. So I think all of those things are really important. And then the final concept I'll just throw out there is I've stopped looking at my supply chain as a healthcare supply chain. We're really a retail outlet. We look like Target. We look like Walmart. I have a whole bunch of things I have to have on the shelf that have to be available when the consumer, clinician, patient wants to consume it. And I have to start thinking about what does it look like to run a transactional supply chain rather than this concept of having a whole bunch of stuff on the shelf all the time, stock just in case maybe I need, and then deal with expiration and other issues down the road.
Can I ask a question to you, Michael? That's awesome insights. Is the best angle in for many new products on the market becoming that strong number 2 in many instances, or do you see that as most common for them to be able to improve service levels, provide a viable alternative to whatever a strong number 1 is?
Yeah, when you say number 2, there's a lot of different ways to define it. For instance, we're very much creating an active diversity program. And it's hard to say I'm going to have 44 hospitals buy from one small vendor. The risk to the system is too great in that context. But what if I were to spot a diversity candidate in each of my regions and make sure that one hospital is buying from them? So I'm supporting the diversity program while at the same time mitigating risk for the system. If I'm buying products from mainline vendors and distributors, what part of the business can I carve out and give to an innovator or an up-and-comer or somebody who needs or is trying to identify a way into the marketplace? And so we're actively always looking for those ways of saying what portion of my buy can actually be dedicated to other channels, and are we actively doing that to insulate ourselves from a risk and mitigation perspective, but also from a how do we help our community? At the end of the day, our supply community should look very much like the community of people that we're serving. And that's not always the case. And sometimes there's no opportunity to make those two things match up. But those are hallmarks to what we ought to be thinking about day in and day out of the supply chain.
Really interesting. And actually, before I even move on, Alicia, any other thoughts in reacting to the stuff you've heard so far? Any other questions or thoughts?
No, I mean, that's pretty spot on, and we agree. I mean, it's really, I literally had a conversation with my VP the other day of, we don't like the term supply chain, but what should it be called instead? And, because the outlook of what supply chain was 50 years ago than what it is today is completely different. And we're no longer box pushers. We're no longer just signing a contract. We are looking at innovation, and we are just as important as the clinicians of keeping that product on the shelf. And, I like when you said these startups should also be working with supply chain, because really we're the ones that have to manage it and maintain it. And so, we've struggled with what should we really be called as, from a term perspective, because I agree, sometimes supply chain is not necessarily what we all just do. It's so much more than that. So I definitely agree with what both Mike and Dan have said.
One final thought on the topic. I do believe that there's massive opportunity for continuous learning and improvement in a peer-to-peer kind of trusted network basis. So this is in a prior life what I built with targeted oncology drugs, to be able to show real world data, real world evidence, what's the cost versus what outcome. I think that same opportunity lives in the high dollar device world as well, to be able to have leading institutions to be able to share a respective cost per case, learn from one another, and understand how that affects ultimately outcomes. And that is a very invaluable stream to a value analysis committee if we can share at scale.
And actually, I'm going to just follow up on that then, Dan. Are people doing that? I mean, is that already happening? Is there cross-institutional knowledge sharing in that area?
We do see that. Yeah, we do see leading institutions who have taken the initiatives through a trusted network be able to share respective cost per case where they are in the spectrum, at least of what we have line of sight to within the network. So they are driving decision making based upon how they compare against the stratified peers within U.S. healthcare.
Yeah, that's great. I'm aware of multiple companies working on the sharing clinical data and clinical insights, patient de-identified data, so that people can make decisions based on learnings at other institutions. But I wasn't aware that the costs and some of those other items are being shared as well. So that's
yeah,
great.
The cost is the missing lens, and it really serves as the bridge to value-based care for high dollar device.
That's terrific. So, coming back to this topic again, a little more on this resilience and digitization, Alicia, that's something that you've mentioned, everyone's mentioned, I think a number of times. Maybe some, examples you can give on, kind of what that means in practice, any products, processes, that have been implemented from, some learnings so far.
Yeah, so we've really taken a focus on trying to take a lot of our manual processes. Again, the role of someone in supply chain is a lot more robust than maybe it used to be. So we're trying to find ways to take some of those manual non-value add or waste tasks off plates, and then we can focus on what we're truly there to do, is to serve our patients, make sure we have what we need on the shelf. And so we've really taken a role into making sure, how do we give the visibility in the data to make and drive those business decisions. A couple of examples, like we mentioned, purchase history. Back in the day, it's called usage, right? But that's not what we're actually utilizing. You could have a clinician purchase 3 to 6 months of inventory and keep it on the shelf, and that's significantly different than how much they're actually using and at what rate. So we've really seen that we can start to show utilization, which will help drive contracts and pricing, forecasting, and we're not just looking at what we're purchasing, but what we're using and what rate, and then how that spans across all 11 hospitals, all 40 plus surgical procedural departments, whatever that may be. We're also looking at waste. I mean, a lot of health systems have a hard time tracking waste. With some of our technology partners, we are now able to say this truly was wasted. We are providing those dispositions and that visibility from the clinical side of open wasted, or we expired it and we owned it and we didn't mitigate it. Again, with our consignment partners, you can get a free replacement swapped on the shelf for a longer shelf life at no risk to you, but the stuff that we own ends up being missioned, and we have to essentially do something with that. So that visibility also keeps us from having to waste that in the future. Do we need to adjust par levels? Is that doctor gone? Why are we having stuff on the shelf that is expiring and not being used? And so it gives us that visibility into those things. big visibility around bill only. I mean, for instance, there's a lot of vendors out there that walk stuff into our hospitals and we have no control, tracking, or visibility into what that is. So we've partnered with vendors to give us that visibility, not only automate and streamline that process, but give us the visibility to now start making better business decisions. I think for us, it's, you can only lean inventory so much. There's only so much you could do with the physical supplies themselves. You have to start thinking outside the box on how you can continue to move that needle forward and find opportunities, whether that be a soft cost, a hard cost, or, whatever it may be, but it's providing that data to give you the tools to do so. And before that, we would run PeopleSoft queries and have to try to come up with the answer. Analysis paralysis, right? And those are not always easy. So having those vendors and those partners to also shine a light on what the problems may be, what the resolutions may be, has been really beneficial in kind of pushing us forward and outside of just supply on the shelf. How can we go beyond that?
And for the others, I'd love you guys to weigh in on some of the things that Alicia was just saying as well. If you have anything that you want to elaborate on that, again, anything that in your practice or things that you've seen, and in particular, Mike too. I was thinking about some of the things that you said earlier about the idea of bringing in maybe some diversity considerations or small vendor considerations. It's one thing to have a large vendor who's got it's got a much bigger ability to have things on consignment or have large inventory. Some of these small vendors don't have that. So I'm just curious, is that aspirational when you talk about bringing in diversity and smaller vendors, or is that something that you're doing right now?
No, we're actively doing it. Diversity, we never really had a formalized program, and we started dabbling right around when the pandemic started. The question always was, what's the win-win proposition in diversity? Because you want to risk mitigate. I can't take 44 hospitals down because one vendor fails to supply. But at the same time, we still want to be making some level of commitment back to our community. And so for us, we said the best way to do that is to spot it throughout the system. Now, there are a few large diversity companies, and we participate when we have an opportunity to do that. Other times that we're really looking at, and for a lot of the startups, if you take 5% of your volume and give it to them, that's a pretty significant win. And so now you can work collaboratively together to make sure that it's actually driving value. So this idea of really regionalizing it and localizing the diversity is working for us. And it has unintended consequences. You start looking at your reprocessing of some of those different value propositions, and all of a sudden there's a momentum that's gained by doing that. And it really challenges the system to start thinking differently. And all of a sudden you start winning awards for taking waste out of the system, when at the end of the day, what you really were trying to do is save money. But those win-win value propositions are what you have to identify. And when there's an opportunity to help the diversity candidate, we'll always kind of head in that direction.
And in addition to the diversity candidate, I'm putting an emphasis too on the small vendor and making them work. Alicia, your comment earlier I thought was great on the idea of being leaner but not too lean in your suppliers, so that that you're not, because I've seen that trend in lots of places where people say, look, we're going to go lean down and only have a couple of suppliers for knee replacement, let's say, or something. We're just going to have one, and that way we don't we can consolidate, and then all of a sudden it's not just anti-competitive, it's also it's, as you said, we can have a problem where suddenly someone's product fails or is recalled, and then you're stuck and you can't deliver care to your populations. So it's great to hear that there's initiatives and interest in not only, as I said, not only leaning but optimizing, which is great, or going the other way, having lots of choices. So again, that could be an entire webinar in itself. So I'm trying to skip around to some other topics here while we have only 20 minutes left in the public broadcast. So maybe one area in particular we could talk about, since it's been mentioned a couple times, is value analysis. Let's go there for a second. So I think I think everyone, at least in our cohort, understands that decisions are no longer made by clinicians themselves saying, hey, I want that product, let's bring that in, and it's bought and used. There may be like some isolated cases of that, but value analysis now, certainly drives all these things. So maybe just a little bit on the value analysis committee and how those calculations are done and what this kind of new world of supply chain looks like. Let's just talk about value analysis. So why don't we start with anyone who wants to raise your hand and talk about that. I'm happy to have anyone weigh in on basically what the world looks like today. I'll go to Michael for this then. If value analysis, is that really driving everything, and how is that changing, if anything?
Yeah, we started 4 years ago with our value analysis program, and it started with the basics of benchmarking and clinical equivalency. And so we have a service, ECRI, that provides a lot of that information for us. And one of the challenges, and this is, I think, really important for the smaller and startup companies, is they say, well, I have differentiation, I'm unique, I'm different. But it's not about whether you have a white paper that states it. It's really, truly, what are your blinded studies that say that demonstrate that you really do? And so that's the important part for us, is to make sure we're understanding exactly what the differentiation is and what is the outcome. We want to achieve a quality outcome. If there's a better way of doing that, we should always challenge ourselves to take that. So with that said, we've evolved now to the point where clinicians are extremely involved. We have service line value analysis committees that meet on a regular basis. All the hospitals have a value analysis meeting that read on a regular basis. And I run an executive steering committee that runs on a quarterly basis, where we're constantly talking about the next big programs that need to take place and who's going to do what to whom. We're piloting, we're demoing, and we're collecting all that information. And it goes from blood products and syringes, but it also includes things like bed rentals and what platform surfaces are needed for wound care. We're only going to make smart decisions in that regard if we take clinical input to heart, and actually becomes kind of a center point for what we're doing. Then you blend in the finance side of it, the ROI, and it becomes a story that you can tell that says, I can achieve this clinical outcome at this value price point. And then that is how you gather momentum across the organization to make large conversions and et cetera. And I'll just kind of highlight, we just went through a spine initiative where our surgeons told us we only need 5 vendors. We don't need the 74 that you've contracted. We have now gone down to 5 vendors with 90% compliance, and it was driven by the physician community. If they hadn't suggested it, I'm not sure that I would have actually gone down that path because of the amount of effort it was going to take. But when a peer is looking at a peer and saying, why don't those 5 product sets meet your needs? That's a very different conversation than the supply chain guy saying, yeah, you know what, I can do it for 10 cents cheaper.
Yeah, no, good point. And, going back, I think, to, again, the innovator part of the, our lens here. So what happens when you've picked 5 spine vendors? Is there still room for the innovator who comes in with something that, again, doesn't have to be part of the 75 company mix, but is there still opportunity then for the newer companies to get into in that world?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why you leave the 10%, is that gives you the ability to try things, different vendors, new techniques, new ideas, all of that kind of blends in together. And so, yeah, in every major conversion program we do, we always leave room for what we think is going to be innovation and potentially diversity.
Great. Dan, before I move on from Dan or Alicia, before I move on from value analysis, anything else you guys want to share on that topic about where things are going and how you've adapted and in that thinking?
Alicia, please.
I was just going to go off of that where, with the diversity, I think that's where there's the good partnership, and a good value analysis team is a good partnership of looking at, obviously clinician driven, this is what I, want, or this is what I think. But then if diversity is a big part of your supply chain, and it's a big initiative, and that's where that partnership comes in to say, hey, that sounds great, but yes, how about we get a diversity vendor in here? That's why you leave room for that 10%. But making sure that you also have some of those values that you bring to the table and making sure that we uphold. I think for us in value analysis, it used to be where, yes, it was clinically driven, but now starting to look at the downstream impacts too. if something's going to save us $2,000, is it really going to cost us more $10,000 on the back end of product waste, tagging, or relabeling, FTE time and hours. So we're starting to also look at the big picture. I think a lot of times it's like, hey, let's look at the dollar value of the conversion. This is a great cost savings opportunity, but we're not looking at the waste and the time and the energy that it takes to do those conversions downstream. And are we really coming out on top, or are we actually losing money in the long end? So I think we're starting to look at also putting through all kinds of requests through value analysis and trying to define, and not so much sometimes being a full gray area, but what are those requisites? What constitutes something going through value analysis versus I can just request it to be added to my inventory. So we're starting to really relook at how value analysis and sourcing and logistics and all of supply chain work together to be one unit, and how can we make that program a little bit more robust so that it incorporates everybody that's part of the process and not just from a cost savings perspective on contracts.
And Dan, you mentioned real world data before, as all of this as well. Is that now a standard? Are people incorporating real world evidence and data?
I'd be interested in Michael and Alicia's perspective. We don't see it, I think, as a universal standard of actually taking our own health systems data and using that to drive real world evidence-based decision-making at the value analysis level. I think it's still mostly driven by trials, but we do have institutions that we're partnering with who are beginning to take that lens, and even in addition, taking RCM as a partner in this well. So revenue cycle management, cost is one thing, reimbursable amount is another. How do we layer in that paradigm with the ultimate decision-making? So, and then to be able to have more intelligent conversations with payer contracting as well. So I do think that this is going to be an emerging trend. The first and foremost, we need compliance of documentation to ensure that we are capturing the thorough product information. That is going to drive everything else downstream to understand what was used, what were the other attribution factors of the particular case that led to what particular outcome, and then ultimately at what cost and reimbursement.
And Paul, if I could just maybe adding one more comment. So what Dan said was really important there about contribution margin. A lot of decisions should be based on, should we even be doing the procedure to begin with? And so we ask ourselves that question all the time. But I think building on it, we also have to make sure that we're connecting the dots all the way throughout. So it's a robust ROI, it's a robust clinical evidence that brings all of that together. And by combining those, you're able then to start having those kind of more dynamic conversations at the payer level to say, for us to do X, Y, and Z, it needs to look like this. But it's also about what else are we doing in kind of our run rate business. Stents, for instance, in the cardiac world. What are we using case by case on average? How are we against the AMA standards? Do we have surgeons that are outside of what those boundaries should be? And if they are, what's the clinical reasons why? And so again, really kind of making it as robust as possible so that you're both driving ROI at the same time driving the outcome.
I'm thinking about one of the questions that I just saw coming from one of our companies as it relates to some of the things we've been talking about. So I'm going to go there for a second, which is the question about competitiveness. So when we're thinking about value, and we're thinking about contracts and bundling and pressures that that some people can put on the system, if you will. One of the question basically is really like how you kind of manage that environment, maybe at the value and the purchasing level, and don't box out a new technology, just because someone has a better bundle of services. Is that something that's on your minds? Is that something that you're adjusting for? Michael, you mentioned that 10% for innovation idea. Is that something that you guys think are in general is done? That there's still like how do we still save room for some of these smaller vendors or smaller things, or am I just being optimistic?
Yeah, well, I mean, Paul, in the context of bundling, I work really hard never to allow vendors to do that, because they box you in. That you need one particular product which you're going to be highly compliant on, and they want to drag a secondary product with it. And by making that commitment, now you lock yourself into penalties on both sides, which does prevent you from decisions down the road. And I won't get into the names, but endomechanical and sutures is one in particular through our health trust that causes a lot of issues and concerns, or really puts cups on what we have the ability to do. So if a large vendor comes to me and wants to handcuff me with a package, it's going to have to be off the charts value to make that kind of a decision, because I've lived through the endomechanical sutures conversation long enough to know that for 4 years now, we have not been able to do clinically what we really want to do to achieve outcomes because of. And so I think sometimes you have to be very careful making those kind of bundle arrangements, and I try to prevent them from happening at Steward.
Thanks, Michael. Anyone else want to comment on that topic?
I think going back to Michael's earlier point around, making sure you have a good foundation first. Again, any kind of technology device, if you don't have a good process, it's a broken foundation. It's going to be a broken technology, a broken device. It's not a broken workflow. So you always want to make sure that your foundation is solid. So for us, we know what we want and we don't settle. So if we have a big technology partner that can't provide us what we want, but it's free, we don't settle for that. We go and find someone that will provide us, but tie it back into our main partner and say, hey, would you guys be willing to partner together? You can't quite provide us 100% what we're looking to get out of this output, but they can. But they might be smaller and not have the resources you do. Are you guys willing to partner together and, kind of combine the two avenues together for the customer to make it easier on us? And then it's kind of a win-win altogether. So, we know what we want and we know the output we want to get. And we're strong in that to say, if, our vendors or partners or distributors can't give us that, then we'll go find it. But we also want to make sure that we're keeping it as one platform, one, standardized way that our supply chain folks, our inventory folks, our clinicians aren't having to go to multiple websites or multiple things in an OR room to get to the same output. It's, how can we work together and bridge the gap even between some smaller startups and our bigger vendors? How can we bridge that gap to get them to work together? So it's no different to us on the customer side. It seems the same, but it gives us what we need on the back end.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that concept. And hopefully more people are thinking that way, because I think that would have a huge impact on, this innovation landscape if you can do more of that partnering and have a partner. And I know it happens in some cases because it has in our portfolio, but where there's a larger partner who can bring some value with that, that they have with their existing infrastructure and customer service and some of the things we've talked about, and help that smaller company who is not going to have those capabilities. So, working together on that, and Dan, maybe a little bit from you kind of on, since you are so involved with, distribution, maybe you can just talk a little bit about this idea again of how innovation gets into the pipeline. In the last 5 minutes or so, I want to just cover a couple last things. And so again, how does, from working with Cardinal, how does innovation get into the pipeline? And when I mean innovation, I mean from some of these, specifically from some of these smaller vendors, how do they get into this consideration?
It always radiates out from our customers, right? Which almost always radiates out from patient need. So we partner with leading health system institutions who are constantly pushing the envelope with us for our technology, right? And so we make decisions all the time on buy versus build, right? Throughout all of Cardinal. And it's a constant. Do we buy a business, right, that complements what we are hearing very specifically from our health system partners? Do we build it ourselves? Are we better positioned based on existing assets to be able to meet this need over a defined period of time using current resources? So that kind of those puts and takes are happening constantly throughout the Cardinal's dozens of business units. So yeah, but the underlying theme with all of it, it starts with the voice of the customer. What is needed? Where are things going? How can we best be prepared with the right products and services to address it?
All right, and digital health, whether they be apps or other things that are, let's say traditionally more digital. How important is that in the future? How much has that become part of the mix at your organizations? It's not just devices and consumables and other things. So how important is digital, and is that something you're focused on?
100%. It is a core theme of Cardinal Health at the corporate level. And if you just look at the data coming out of health systems and leading CFOs, who Health Management Academy put out a recent survey talking to leading health system CFOs on what's top priorities. It's no secret the margins are still, operating margins are 50% what they were pre-pandemic. So the biggest cost yet is people. It's labor, right? It's still a massive issue. There's not going to be enough people to solve some of the core problems. So we're going to need to invest intelligently in technology. The focus of leading CFOs for the foreseeable future is going to be, I think, less on the mega millions put into the electronic health record and more on now getting value out of the existing technologies and investing in technologies that are going to spur automation, absent of readily available, affordable labor, and throughput and workflow. How do we get more volume, more effectiveness? How do we make better decisions by looking at things holistically? So I think we're going to see a lot more trends in digital health going after things that we can have software do what it was meant to do, which is replace repetitive manual tasks.
Great. Alicia, anything you want to weigh in on that topic?
I mean, I just go back to the basic phrase of work smarter, not harder. I mean, that's really, with all of the challenges we face today, even within the last 5 years, there's always something else around the corner that's going to come in and put more onto our plate. And we're not getting more people to do this work. Actually, more people are leaving and the workload is staying on those that are left behind. So how do we put in the processes, whether it be with technology or not? How do we put in the processes to work smarter, not harder? Do things that don't take as much effort with the same amount of people, if not less, and look at ways that we could take a lot of that waste off of our plates, where, again, it was fine to do in the past, but workload has changed and more keeps coming on top of clinicians, supply chain, leadership. It's always more, and we got to find ways that we can actually have time to do the more by taking a lot of the non-value add tasks off our plates and using things like, even if it's process improvement, lean strategies, technology, whatever it may be, finding ways to kind of continue to push the needle forward without adding more people to do so or adding more money to do so. If that's a possibility, great, but sometimes even just the little changes can completely make you work smarter, not harder. So.
Thank you. All right, only a couple minutes left in the first hour of this. So I just want to close with any thoughts you might have in terms of advice to those who are watching and listening. As I said, a lot of them are innovators out there, mostly. So any particular advice you want to share, and then also if you can just let them know how they might contact you, like whether it's a LinkedIn or other way, but how also if people want to reach out and follow up with you, how they might do that. So I'll start with you, Dan. Any advice that you want to give to people, especially reflecting on the conversation?
Absolutely. Lean heavy into the clinical evidence, follow the tried and true KOL partner model and advisor model. I think a lot of this is kind of table stakes for those who are later stage and have already pursued that. That's really critical. Also be willing and ready to adapt into more of a real world evidence paradigm. Embrace that. I think that is an opportunity where some of the stalwarts, the competitors may not be. They have much more to lose to enter in a world of real world data and transparency. For disruptors to be able to embrace that and tap into data at scale to actually use that data is a massive opportunity for, I think, medtech disruptors coming into this space. And then also table stakes of a good commercial infrastructure. Make sure you are investing appropriately in the right sales organization, the right people, and the right CRM to be able to track and ensure that you are optimizing your people's time and you're working smarter, not harder.
Good advice. Repeating some of the things we've been talking about. Thank you. And reaching you, Dan, if people want to get in touch with you, do they find you on LinkedIn or?
LinkedIn is a great avenue. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Let me go to Michael. Michael, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No, it's great to have you. So again, just concluding thought. Any kind of general advice that you want to give, tips again for the innovators that are out there, as well as how to reach you.
Yeah.
Oh, we may have lost you again, Mike. All right, Michael. I'm going to go to Alicia since I'm not hearing you, Michael. Alicia, your turn.
Yeah, so I think the big theme for, innovators that are trying to come into a space is know your customers, know your competitors, know the market. But overall,
when we were going forward,
Sorry, not able to hear you, Michael. So we'll just let Alicia finish, and then if your internet clears up, we'll bring you back. Alicia, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so really starting small. So, we talked about how can you be a little fish in a big pond. Across organizations and across healthcare, there are little fish in big ponds. You might be a one hospital system versus a health system of hundreds or, multiple hospitals or departments. So starting small and, getting in, go to these conferences, get in front of people who are looking at, I was just at a conference recently and there were so many vendors there that were all kind of doing the same thing. It's like finding how you're going to set yourself apart, but starting small and being able to utilize your customer to market it for you. We're now in this day and age that, I hate to say it, sometimes customers don't always trust the vendor, and you're always trying to sell us something, you have an ulterior motive, right? Getting and starting small with even just one hospital and having them partner with you to help drive it. Every single time that any of our partnered vendors want to get a new customer, they bring to an existing customer. Hey, Alisha, can you talk to this customer? Can you do this? And that's what's going to kind of drive and market your product, because they're hearing it from people who are like them, who have the same problems, and they can ask those questions and they know they'll get the real answer. Versus, with a vendor, they're always worried about, are they telling me the truth? So sometimes it is good being the small fish in the big pond, starting with a hospital that is a small fish in a big pond, and just starting small and kind of utilizing your customers to help, sell it for you. So.
Great advice. It's something I don't think we all think about enough, is that customer reference and having your customer be somebody who can sell your product for you is something that I think is probably underutilized. So thank you for that. Great advice. And also, Alicia, if people want to find you, they want to reach out to you, are you available on things like LinkedIn, or what's the best way to find you?
Yep, LinkedIn's the best way.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alicia. And Michael.
Try again.
Try again. Yes.
All right. So as I was saying, don't be a me too product. Be differentiated. 2, come with credible information. Know what the ROI looks like. Know what the contribution margins look like. Help me understand how I can help you be successful. Oftentimes, I get approached by smaller companies or innovators, and they're like, "Well, I've got this great value proposition. Help me sell it." And it's like, "Well, okay, I'm happy to try and help you sell it, but I need to know the kind of the wheres and the hows and the where to's to make that work." And then Alicia says something very important, which I do fundamentally believe as well, which is a lot of it needs to originate at the local level. So find a clinician at one of my local hospitals who has an interest in what you're doing, and they'll send an email on our behalf, and they'll reach out to the corporate team and ask us to get engaged. And then the other thing is think about what you're really trying to accomplish. You're probably not going to land at 44 hospitals all at one time. Your chance to actually even deliver value across all 44 would stretch you beyond what your limits are. And so just to have a credible scaling plan in mind when you're thinking about how it is you want to engage with us. And by connecting those dots, I think you have a real chance to be successful.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And again, same question for you. Are you available on LinkedIn, and or is there a better way to find you?
Yeah, you can certainly try and get me on LinkedIn. I'm not on it all the time, but you check in probably a couple times a week. I look at all my messages, and I really try to be responsive. I'll even tell you, if there's no interest, I'll tell you right up front there's no interest.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. So again, terrific panel. We covered a ton of stuff. So much more to unpack in our Q&A after this, so stick around for that. But we really appreciate all the wisdom and the insight. It was incredibly helpful for me, and I'm sure our companies and other viewers as well. So thank you all for that. For those of you on YouTube, your time is up now here at the 1 hour. But you can watch this archived on our website or YouTube. You can go to medtechinnovator.org/live for this, as well as our past and upcoming episodes. You can subscribe to a list that will send you a message and remind you when our upcoming webinars are happening. So we encourage you to do that. We thank you for being here. And we're going to stick around now for the Q&A with our panel. But thank you, everyone, on the outside for watching.